that mix immigration regimes. What are the immigration laws? What are the types of visas? What are the types of laws that, regulations that allow workers to enter and take these jobs? And as several people have mentioned, they're often not allowed to come in legally, and that of course sets them up for the kinds of abuse and exploitation that we've talked about. I think no country does this more robustly than the United States, which has a policy I call demand and denial. We have an incredible demand for private labor, private care workers, and yet we deny them visas, we deny them entry, and we derogate them when they do come. But to get back to the intimate spaces, it seems to me that this is a particular place, it's a particular kind of workplace. The home, the household is a particular kind of workplace that depends on workers not only providing physical labor and practical assistance, but also emotional labor. This is what Arlie Hochschild calls surplus emotional value. In other words, workers are supposed to be especially dedicated, and different groups of workers from different countries are identified using various kinds of ethnic stereotypes. Oh, the so-and-sos really like elders, or oh, the so-and-sos are really gentle and great with children, and so forth. They're kind of these self-serving stereotypes. But the expectation is that the workers will deny their own emotional needs and the emotional needs of the family members they left behind in order to provide this surplus emotional value to the people they're caring for. And they do it very well. So they're valued verbally very well. They're not always compensated accordingly. And this creates what's obscured in this, of course, is the fact that the workers' relatives back home are being denied of that same emotional value that's being lavished on their relatives. And in other words, what's happening is we know a lot about brain drains. There's also a care drain. There is a tilt of caring resources from poorer countries to wealthier countries, from the global south to the global north, if you will. How does this tilt play out, and what are its consequences? First, it's important to point out that these migrant women are fully conscious of the dynamic. They're not doing it without thinking about it, and they try to compensate as much as they can by setting up global care chains, and then by acting as what Pierre Hidalgo-Sotelo has called transnational mothers. That is, they're not just sending remittances, but they're also staying in touch with their families, using cell phones and Skyping to try to supervise their children, run their households, and trying to send virtually as much affection as they possibly can. The jury is still out on the effects of this. Rosel Pereñas has found that children appreciate what their absent mothers are trying to do in terms of sending financial support, but that they still feel the loss of their immediate presence. When the mothers finally do return, they often feel alienated. They have difficulty restoring previous relationships. This also happens when children manage to join their mothers in the receiving countries, which often takes many years to happen. By that time, their relationships are so attenuated that it's really difficult for them to readjust. In many countries, the global care chain, in many situations, the global care chains break down, and then mothers are blamed for abandoning their children. You probably have heard, maybe you've heard the phrase Euro orphans, which is a term that Helma Lutz has discovered has been used to talk about mothers in the Ukraine and Poland. These are women who actually are doing circular migration. They go and come back, but whatever arrangements they've made for their children in their absence often break down. Children are running around the streets, or so people say, and the mothers are neglecting them. So even though they're trying to do the best they can for their families, they're often blamed for doing it. So the upshot is that in some developing countries, we talked about the Millennial Development Goals earlier. In some developing countries, I think that some of the goals, but especially the ones pertaining to children, have actually fallen short. People have fallen short of meeting them because the mothers aren't there to make sure that the children go to school, that they get good nutrition, that they go to clinics. I'm not saying that nobody else can do it, and I'm certainly not condoning the division of labor that calls for this, but in many cases, the absence of mothers means that these things are just not happening. So in a way, the global system, this global division of labor, is undermining things like the Millennial Development Goals. Mothers or other women, we talked about this before, may return, but when they're burned up, when they can no longer work, they return to their home countries without Social Security, without pensions, and then they, become dependent on their families. Presumably, the remittances that they've been sending has bought them some goodwill from their families, but increasingly there is no they can't do it. It's a burden. Okay, I think one of the problems with regulating for this is not just all the things that the labor, the organizing problems that people have talked about, but also siloization within international organizations and between international organizations. And I can talk about this more in the Q&A. However, in 2009, the UN and the UN Development Program and the ILO came up with a joint report on work and families, and they talked about migration. And here, just let me quickly say what they proposed as measures to alleviate some of the kinds of problems that we've been talking about. Creating sufficient opportunities for decent work for men and women so that people can earn enough income in their own countries so that they don't have to migrate. I mean, I know that migration is a right, but it would be nice if you didn't have to migrate. You could just work where you are. Facilitating the return of those who migrate, helping family reunification through reintegration and training programs, establishing regulations that make it easier for families of migrant workers to reunite, and I would add also promoting circular migration, even though I know my colleague from the FBI doesn't agree with that, but I still think people are going to do it. We may as well legalize it. Guaranteeing that migrant workers have the same labor rights as others and access to child care, health care, and so forth. And then finally, involving the employing sector as co-responsible for obeying the laws and making it easier for working parents to have in terms of legislation and so forth regarding social protection. So, that's it. That's
So, thank you, Sonia, for that nice segue into talking about the intimate spaces of globalization, which I think adoption certainly forces us to think about. I should say I'm actually an anthropologist. You might not have known that from my little bio, and that's how I came to be involved in the study of transnational adoption, specifically from China. So most of what I'll draw on here is related to China, but I wanted to present a broader picture as well. In the early 1990s, the adoption of children across national borders began to accelerate at a truly astonishing rate for a variety of reasons that I don't have time to get into here. By the end of the 90s, close to 140,000 adopted children, transnationally adopted children, arrived in the US alone. Small numbers compared to the migration figures we've been hearing about, but nonetheless, this was a huge change over the decade. This adoption boom continued until 2004. In that year, globally, almost 44,000 children were adopted transnationally from the 15 countries that were considered the leading sending countries, among them China and Russia. When I was doing research on adoption in China in the early 2000s, so a little while ago, I saw no sign of this trend abating. But the reality is that the global adoption market is highly volatile. 2005, the year my book was published, was actually the peak in Chinese adoptions. In that year, China sent 14,000 children abroad, which was up from 100 when it started in 1991. By 2013, the last year for which we had data, that number had declined to 3,400. And globally, the numbers plummeted from 44,000 to 19,000. So I would say it's important to keep in mind how fluid and volatile this market is. Unlike other forms of migration, which seem to keep growing. And also to keep in mind that adoption, like other forms of migration, is dependent upon a host of political, economic, legal, and cultural factors. And as the migration panel at lunch reminded us, deeply embedded in a whole range of structural problems that must be addressed if the problems in adoption can be addressed. We tend to think of transnational adoption as the flow of young children from poor nations to the more affluent West, with all the inequalities that that entails and reproduces. But what I think is also interesting is more recent counter-movements of older adoptees, sometimes in their 20s or 30s, revisiting their countries of birth, or sometimes even younger if they travel with their families. The flows, in other words, are now in both directions. And it is an open question how return journeys will change the cultural and policy landscape. Such journeys take multiple forms: heritage tours for younger kids, birth parent searches for older adoptees, and in some cases, as in South Korea, political and social activism in the country of origin. In an increasingly globalized world, these crisscrossing flows in multiple directions take place in space that is both real and virtual. And the role of the internet and social media, I think, can't be underestimated here. The explosion of transnational adoption in the 90s coincided with all sorts of cultural shifts in the US, including the rise of open adoption and domestic birth mother activism, who demanded access to previously sealed records. For transnational adoptees, the most dramatic shift was the shift from the erasure of history, race, and difference, which had been denied from the beginning of this in the 1950s when transnational adoption began, to a much greater openness to address and actually embrace difference, race, and history. And again, you can't get into this, but there are many interesting films made by Korean adoptees that deal with this issue of being told that they were white and middle class, white bread, middle America, and discovering later on that they were not, or not completely. These kinds of changes were in full bloom in the early 1990s when the Hague Convention on Inter-Country Adoption was drafted and signed. The convention is interesting in part because it urged countries to do whatever necessary to enable a child to remain in the country of birth, or if that was impossible, to stay with the family in that country. So it was not promoting adoption by any means. Transnational adoption was said to be the third best option if the other two were not possible. Somewhat paradoxically, the convention insists on the child's right to identity, assumed to be rooted in the culture and nation of its birth, and on the right to a loving family. And there's a large literature on how adoptees and their families negotiate this tension between sort of nation and family. Let me, because there's not that much time, I'll turn quickly to what is, I see the changes in China over the last 10 years. As probably you all know, adoption in China is inextricably tied to the one-child policy, which prompted families often to abandon a baby girl in the hope of having a boy for a second child. And the narrative of the one-child policy became part of what adoptive parents were also taught to tell their kids and tell themselves. So instead of just, your parents gave you up because they couldn't take care of you even though they loved you so much, it was a much more complicated sort of political narrative about policy in China. The dramatic downturn that I mentioned earlier is caused by all sorts of factors that vary from country to country. In some cases, corruption and baby selling shut down programs, Guatemala, Nepal, Vietnam, or geopolitics, as in the case of Russia, which Yasmin's actually written about very eloquently, or in the case of South Korea, domestic pressure and criticism. In China, the dramatic decline is very different explanations, and I'll just run through them here to give you a sense of how sort of varied this landscape is. Although demand from the West continues to be sky high, China simply doesn't have a supply of adoptable children, especially healthy infants. Economic growth has meant that there are fewer so-called over-quota babies. Parents can afford to pay the fines that they're required. More prosperous families can adopt in China. The policies of the government restricting adoption domestically have been eased. And even though they've been eased, Chinese parents are not actually responding and having more kids because for various reasons, including in the absence of nannies, they don't want to do that right now, in the urban areas especially. And finally, I should say that the ready availability of ultrasound cheaply in the countryside has led to more sex-selective abortions and hence the birth of fewer unwanted girls. The consequences of these changes, that fewer healthy babies are available, have had an interesting effect on the community in places like the US. When China announced new guidelines some years ago for adoptive parents, which raised, or rather lowered the age, targeted gay, lesbian, single, and older parents, people who were depressed, people who were overweight. There were a whole slew of things you couldn't be if you wanted to adopt. Americans reacted with outrage on how retrograde these policies were. But what they completely missed was that the babies were not there, and this sense of entitlement was totally striking, even among highly educated, sophisticated, progressive parents. In conclusion, I want to say something about what I think is a really interesting development. In the adoption literature, one talks about the triad with the birth parents and the adoptive parents and the adoptees. And typically, it's the adoptees and the birth parents who are sort of missing from having their voices expressed. But I think that's changing, and I'll just say something about adoptees here. As the first generation of Chinese kids is coming of age and are now in their 20s, we've begun to hear more of their voices. There's a really interesting blog by one of them called Red Thread Broken, which is a riff on a Chinese proverb that's sort of misused in the adoption community, on the red thread, eternally connecting parents and children who are destined to be together. I'll just read you a paragraph from her blog, but I recommend looking at it if you're interested. She writes, "Adoptive parents need to realize that adoptions are not destined to happen. They are the results of political and economic systems of oppression that entrap biological mothers around the world, whether that be the social